Hey, I watched a movie recently. I've started watching a lot more movies, it seems, since we discovered how to rig our phone up and tap into Netflix without paying for it. You get to watch all kind of things. Um, and my son and my wife, they were the ones that did this. I don't know how to do it, you know. Of course, they rigged it up for me. And they were watching a movie that some of y'all may have seen. It was released last year. It's called First Man. And it's the story of Neil Armstrong and the first trip to the moon, 1969, the year before I was born. And, you know, I grew up hearing about the first man on the moon, and it was a done deal. And everybody was very proud of it. I was told we beat the Russians. They were in a race with us. We got there first. But in watching this movie, it started in like the early 60s with Kennedy's speech saying we're going to have a man on the moon by the end of this decade. And there was a remarkable amount of opposition to this whole idea of going to the moon. And it wasn't so much that people hated the idea of going to the moon, but it was very expensive. And a whole lot of money is involved in that, and a whole lot of accidents happened in the process. And it was not going well. For example, the Apollo crew, all five members of the Apollo crew were killed in a fiery explosion as they got closer and closer to launching this trip to the moon. One of the chief astronauts, Chuck Bassett, was killed. He was a pilot. And Neil Armstrong's own wife was totally against this because she never saw him. You can kind of understand that, but she was like, you're gonna get killed, and he had to talk to his sons before he left, and they said, is there a chance you won't come back? And he was like, we're taking every precaution. And they said, that means you may not come back, right? There was a lot of opposition from his own family. There was social opposition in this movie. They even used a lot of actual footage from the 1960s of people protesting. And I'm talking about it wasn't old geezers protesting. It was hippies, young hippies protesting. We should be spending this money to feed the hungry. The civil rights movement got involved. There was this like 200-member group, civil rights activists who marched on NASA protesting all this. A whole lot of people did not want this to happen. And yet Neil Armstrong, for lots of reasons, had this way of tuning out all the naysayers, of being so focused on his mission, understanding what a huge step for mankind this was going to be. And all the opposition, newscasters, interviewers, trying to tear him apart, he just remained calm. And what Neil Armstrong demonstrated, even before he successfully walked on the moon, he demonstrated what I want to refer to as the high art of not paying attention. Did you know that there are times when paying attention is the dumbest thing you can do? Now, I was taught in school, pay attention, pay attention. Sunday school, pay attention. Little boy in church, elbows, pay attention, pay attention. And surely there's a whole lot of stuff. Oh, by the way, you better pay attention. Pay attention right now. But there are other things in this world that you can't afford to pay attention to. Because if you do pay attention to people who are trying to tear you down, people who are down on you, who are professional, certified discouragers. And by the way, I knew this preacher once in Montgomery, Alabama. He had this woman that was always coming up yakking at him, and he said, I want to ask you a question, ma'am. do you believe in spiritual gifts? Oh, yes, I believe my Bible. I believe in spiritual gifts. He said, well, do you think there's a spiritual gift of discouragement? I don't think there is. If it is, it doesn't come from God. But there are certain people, naysayers, people who don't believe in you, people who want to tear you down, people who want to see you fail, even as a Christian. Did you know there's a lot of people who really don't want you to succeed as a Christian? Because if you succeed and you start living this victorious life, then they gotta admit, at least to themselves, hey, it worked. And they'd rather it not work, because if it worked for you, it might work for them, and their excuse has always been, well, it wouldn't work. Be careful about who you pay attention to. Jesus was. I want to read you a scripture, part of a verse from Mark 5:36, and I'll come back and read the whole verse later. Mark 5:36. But Jesus paid no attention to what they said. The high art of not paying attention. Jesus knew that some things are worth paying attention to, and some things are not worth paying attention to. In fact, there are some things you cannot afford to pay attention to. Some people you cannot afford to pay attention to, because all they'll do is pull you down, or they'll pull you off track. Well, it seems one day Jesus was summoned to the house of a synagogue leader whose name was Jairus. And Jairus sent a servant with an urgent message. Come quick. My little girl is dying. If you will come quickly, and if you can get here before she dies, there's hope for her. I've heard good things about you. So Jesus started out heading that direction. But on the way, he got interrupted. Because as he went through the crowd, hustling, bustling, people bumping all up against him, something odd happened. He felt some power go out of him. In the King James, he said, I felt virtue go out of me. And he said, who touched me? And the disciple says, Lord, what do you mean, who touched you? Everybody's bumping up against you. You're like Elvis in the middle of a crowd just before a concert. Everybody's touching you. He said, no, I felt the power go out. And it turned out to be the woman with the issue of blood. And she said, if I could only touch the hem of his garment, I know I'd be healed. And she was healed. And he stopped and he said, woman, your sins are forgiven. Go in peace. He stopped and blessed her. You know why? Even though he was on his way to somewhere important, urgent even, he was willing to stop for something that was truly worth his attention. But there were other things that were not worth his attention. For example, what we find in verse 35 of Mark chapter 6. While he was still speaking to her, the messengers arrived from the home of Jairus, the leader of the synagogue. They told him, your daughter is dead. There's no use troubling the teacher now. But Jesus overheard them and said to Jairus, don't be afraid, just have faith. One translation, Jesus paid no attention to what they said. What was he hearing them say? Gloom and doom. They were saying, oh, it's too late now. Maybe if you'd heard it a little faster, maybe if you hadn't stopped and wasted your time on that woman, you know, she could have waited. She'd had that issue of blood for 30 years. It wouldn't have hurt her to wait another day. But no, you had to stop. Jesus. And now the girl's dead. But Jesus paid no attention to them. Instead, he said to the father, don't be afraid. Just trust. It's going to be all right. By the way, the people who were delivering this news that the girl was dead, I just got to tell you the truth. Do you know anybody who just gets the biggest kick out of sharing bad news? Do y'all know what I'm talking about? There are some people who'd be willing to die if they could have the opportunity of telling you about their funeral arrangements. I mean, bad news travels fast because some people just can't wait to share it. That's the kind of people we were dealing with here. She's dead, Jesus. She's dead. Graveyard dead, Jesus. She's dead. Don't even bother. But Jesus paid. He paid no attention to them. That had no effect on Jesus because Jesus knew there are some things and some people worth listening to and giving your attention to. But these dream killers, these faith squishers, these people who are always predicting the worst and disappointed if it doesn't happen, you can't afford to listen to very many of those people. Jesus constantly had to ignore people like that. You know, when he got ready to feed the 5,000 men, not counting the women and children, he had to ignore his disciples. He had to practice the fine art of not paying attention to them because they were saying, all we got is 2 fish and a few loaves. What are these among so many? We don't have enough money to buy food for even a fraction of these people. You know what? Jesus paid no attention to them. That did not deserve his attention. Some things don't deserve an answer. By the way, I want to free you up and give you a little permission here. Do you realize, or are you okay with knowing that sometimes when people ask you questions that they got no business asking because it's none of their bizwax, do you ever feel like it's your human obligation to give them a full explanation of whatever they asked about? Some of us do. Do you ever feel like, well, okay, they've asked. They're kind of prying. They're butting into something, but they did ask. I've got to give them an explanation. I've got to justify myself. No, you don't. There are some questions that don't deserve an answer. One of my favorite old Hank Jr. songs from when I was a kid, Waylon and Hank Jr. are talking about Senior, and Waylon said, Hank, you just got to tell me, did your daddy really write all them songs? And Hank Jr. said, that don't deserve no answer, hoss. Let's light up and just move along. Try that on somebody. Some questions don't deserve an answer, whether you light up or not. Still just move along, okay? Nehemiah learned the high art of not paying attention. Nehemiah had gone back to Jerusalem after it was conquered and the walls were broken down. The place was in ruins. He went back there to rebuild the walls, to rebuild that which was broken down. And here's the thing. Whether you're an astronaut trying to be the first man on the moon, whether you're Jesus on the way to heal Jairus' daughter, whether you're Nehemiah trying to rebuild what was broken down, whether you're a concerned Christian trying to rebuild a relationship with somebody that's hurt, guess what? There's going to be plenty of people who will try to divert you, who will try to tell you it can't be done. They'll try to tell you that it's no use. They may even oppose you and attempt to sabotage you for strange reasons. Nehemiah chapter 6, verse 4 through 7, Nehemiah was building the wall, and his enemies His enemies, who were, for the most part, Jews themselves, they should have been glad he was building the wall. But, some people just like to talk about how bad things are. Yeah, our walls are broken down. And it's almost like it was almost disappointing to them that the walls were being rebuilt, because then they'd have nothing else to complain about. 4 times they sent the same message. Each time I gave the same reply. This is Nehemiah's own words. The 5th time, Sanballat's servant came with an open letter in his hand. And this is what it said. There's a rumor among the surrounding nations. Geshem tells me it's true that you and the Jews are planning to rebel, and that's why you're building the wall. See, he's trying to create some fear. People who try to manipulate almost always use either fear or guilt or both. In this case, they're using fear. They're saying, the other nations think you're trying to stage a revolt by building this wall. Watch out. According to his reports, you plan to be their king. He also reports that you've appointed prophets in Jerusalem to proclaim about you. Look, there's a king in Judah. All of this was false. They were just trying to sabotage something good. Some people would rather pour cold water on good ideas than they would eat when they're hungry. Some people just love doing that. That's what kind of people. They said, you can be very sure that this report's going to get back to the king. So I suggest that you come and talk it over with me. They're wanting to pull Nehemiah into a trap. They're wanting to demand a whole lot of explanations that they don't deserve. They need to light up and move along. Nehemiah didn't tell them that, but here's what he did tell them. This is beautiful. It's the best verse to me in the whole book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah 6:3. So I replied by sending this message to them. I am engaged in a great work, so I can't come. The King James says, I'm engaged in a great work and I cannot come down. When you've got something honorable, noble, good that you have dedicated yourself to do, there will be people who will try to get you to come down to their level. And you have to say, I'm engaged in a great work, and I cannot come down. You got to watch that with other people. You also got to watch it with your inner critic. I hadn't mentioned her lately, but she's in your head somewhere. She's real sneaky. Your inner critic is that little voice that is stronger in some of us than in others, but we've all got it. In one way or another, your inner critic is always the one that says, you can't do this. Look what a mess you just made of that. What a pathetic parent you are. All this kind of stuff. Your inner critic, don't believe, don't listen. Remember, when that inner critic starts in on you, practice the high art of not paying attention. And remember that just because a thought goes through your head does not mean that God said it. I knew some people growing up, every time they'd have a thought, they would say, God just spoke to me. And God would tell them all kind of ridiculous things. God can speak to you through your mind. But the Bible says, don't believe every spirit, but try the spirits, whether they be of God. If it's a thought that's only going to pull you down, that's only going to tear you down and make you less of a person, that's going to make you come down from the great work, the noble aims you have, don't believe everything you think. Watch out for the inner critic. And then there are critics. There are some Christian people who will try to sabotage you. You hear a lot these days about people worried about the future of the church. Where's the money going to be in the years to come? And what's the future church going to be like? Well, I'll say a couple things about that. One is the church of the future is going to be very different from what we now know, from what we've all grown up with. But think about it. The church of the day is very different than the church of 100 years ago. It's totally different from the church in the Middle Ages. That's not a bad thing. The church knows how to evolve and adapt. And that's one reason the gates of hell cannot prevail against it. So the church is going to survive. The church is going to be good. But there are some people who will get down on the church. Back in the 1930s, okay? One of the most famous Methodist preachers in America was named Clovis Chappell. And when he was a young man, he went to a church, and he got there, and one of the concerned members came up to him. I want to show you what he said. The man came up to Clovis Chappell, and this is Clovis's own quote. Keep in mind, 1930s. See if this sounds like something somebody would say today, okay? A man told me recently with a voice of despair that with the depression and the death of so many of our older members, because those are the people that give most of the money, our church was headed for the rocks. But instead of bursting into tears and getting ready to move, I paid absolutely no attention to him. This is a habit I have tried with some degree of success to cultivate throughout my ministry. Well, we need to try to cultivate the high art of not paying attention. Jesus had to use the art of not paying attention sometimes with his own family. Yes, believe it or not, sometimes your own family members can be the very people who will try to discourage you from doing whatever it is you feel led by God to do. Jesus himself experienced that. I want to give you a couple of scriptures also from the book of Mark, this chapter 3. You may know this, many of you know this. When Jesus first got started, his family, his brothers and sisters, they thought he had lost it. They thought he turned into a nutcase. Mark 3:21. When his family heard what was happening, they tried to take him away. They said he's out of his mind. Mark 3:32-35, they came to get him. They were going to bring him back home. I mean, he's embarrassed us enough. There was a crowd sitting around Jesus, and someone said, "Your mother and your brothers are outside asking for you." Jesus replied, "Who is my mother? Who are my brothers?" Then he looked around those around him and said, "Look, these are my mother. These are my brothers. These are my sisters. Anyone who does God's will is my brother and my sister and my mother." And he didn't invite them in. And he did not pay attention to what they had to say. In fact, he didn't even give them the opportunity to say what he knew they were going to say. Now, was he being disrespectful? No. Sometimes the best way to honor your father and mother, in some cases, especially if you are an adult, sometimes, this is not a blank check now, sometimes the best way to honor your father and mother, if you are an adult, is to practice the high art of not paying attention to them. That's what Jesus was doing, because if he had paid attention, if he had listened to them, his ministry would have ended. They didn't get it. They didn't get it. There are certain things he could not afford to soak in. He couldn't afford to listen to. And on the way to Jairus' house, he kept going, even though they said, "She's dead. You're wasting your trip." I want to read to you what happened, how this turned out. This is Mark 5, verse 38-42. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw much commotion and weeping and wailing. He went inside and asked, "Why all this commotion and weeping?" The child isn't dead, she's only asleep. That's what Jesus said. The crowd laughed at him. Do y'all know the difference between a crowd laughing with you and at you? They were laughing at him. But you know what? You're going to see. Jesus did not pay any attention to their laughs. But he made them all leave. Why make them all leave? Because I don't need those kind of people around me when I'm doing serious work for God. Made them all leave. And he took the girl's father and mother and his 3 disciples, Peter, James, and John, into the room where the girl was lying. Holding her hand, he said to her, Talitha cum, which means, little girl, get up. And the girl, who was 12 years old, immediately stood up and walked around. And they were overwhelmed and amazed. Do you know what? If Jesus had paid attention to the people who said there's no use, if Jesus had paid attention to the people who said there's no hope, this is a waste of time. There are some people you and I cannot afford to listen to any more than we absolutely have to. And I'm not meaning everybody now. You know who they are. Here's a way to tell. When you get off the phone with a person, or you leave their house, or you leave the cafe where you had lunch with them, if you feel lighter, if you feel more joyful than when you went, if you have a positive feeling about yourself and the future and this person, and you walk away uplifted, go to coffee with that person every day. But if you hang up, if you turn off your phone after talking with them, or you read their text message, or you leave their house, and you're basically going, nobody likes me, everybody hates me. If you go away discouraged, if you go away down, despondent, despairing, worried, stressed, there are people you cannot afford to give your attention. Do you know one reason? When 2 people get together, a negative and a positive person, there's an energy exchange. I've had it happen many times. A person who is happy, joyful, vibrant spiritually, and they're growing, and they spend an hour with somebody who's been sucking lemons all day, and spend an hour with somebody who's got their lips pooched out and don't believe in laughing and all this. You spend an hour with somebody like that, and here's what will often happen. If you haven't noticed it, it's probably because you weren't paying close attention, but start paying attention. When you leave that conversation, they're going to be feeling better. You're going to be feeling worse. Now, I'm not saying don't try to help people like that, but I'm saying set your boundaries with people like that. You can only afford to give them so much of your attention. Even back in the 1930s, radio producers had figured this out. Has anybody started watching Ken Burns' new documentary on country music? I've watched the first one and about half of the second one, and it was in the 1930s. The Carter family, A.P. Carter, who wrote a lot of the songs, and he was the businessman. He was the promoter. Guess what? His wife, Sarah, left him for another man. He never got over it, and understandably why. He was very despondent. But they agreed to do like movie stars and just keep making public appearances together and making records and being on the radio. And that worked for a while. But do you know what finally happened? at one big radio station that was broadcasting all over the country. The radio manager pulled A.P. Carter aside. He said, I understand why you're despondent. I know you're hurting. He said, but your depression and your despair is coming through in your lyrics, and it's a downer for the audience. And he took the founding member of the Carter family off. And from then on, it was just Sarah and Mother Maybelle. Even by radio, a person's negative, despairing mood comes through. And people would turn off that radio, and they didn't know why. They just knew, usually the Carters make me feel good, but I'm just kind of down today. There's an energy exchange. Watch out for that. Some people you can't afford. The high art of not paying attention. Let me say one more thing about that. How do you not pay attention to something that's only going to tear you down? You're involved in a great work. You don't want to come down, just as Nehemiah did not. But how do you keep from getting pulled in that? Well, here's something an old horse trainer taught me years ago. He said, Lance, a horse can only keep his mind on one thing at a time. He might get distracted, but for most of the time, he can only keep his mind on one thing. And I began to learn that I was the same way. And I began to learn that the only way I could get my mind off of one bad thing was to get it onto some good thing. I can tell you this, you've been insulted, you've been pulled down. Don't fall for the lie in your head that says, you need to analyze this and really pick it apart and understand it better. And the more you do that, then you'll feel better. Lie. Don't believe it. The more you mess with it, the worse it's going to get. It's going to be like a hairball in your mouth that gets bigger and bigger. Okay? The way you move away from things that don't deserve your attention is to turn your attention to something that does. By the way, how's your left foot feeling right now? Like dancing? Have you thought about your left foot this whole sermon? Think about it right now. It's been there all along. You just never gave it attention. But right now, a whole lot of you, probably not all of you, but a lot of you are thinking about your left foot right now, and you're not thinking about something else. It's that simple. What you focus your attention on. Energy follows attention. You hear me? Positive energy follows attention. That's why it's so important to focus on, as Philippians 4:8 says, whatsoever things are noble, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are of good report. If there's any virtue, if there's any praise, think on these things. And if you can't think of that, think your left foot. Even your left foot is better to pay attention to than some people. Develop the high art of not paying attention to destructive voices.